The world has a word for Dolly Parton: sunshine. It has always been sunshine. From the rhinestone-studded stages of Nashville to the silver screens of Hollywood, from the small towns of Appalachia that claimed her as their greatest daughter to the global arenas that confirmed what those towns always knew. For 79 years, she has been the warmth the world runs toward when it needs reminding that goodness is real, that laughter can survive hardship, that a girl born with nothing can build everything. But here is the truth the sunshine has always carried in its shadow. The woman who has spent a lifetime making the world feel held has spent that same lifetime navigating a private landscape of loss, physical pain, and quiet heartbreak that the spotlights were never wide enough to fully illuminate. Yet the woman who wrote, "I Will Always Love You," one of the most tender declarations in the history of popular music, wrote it as a goodbye. The woman who has smiled through every photograph, every interview, every stage entrance for nearly 6 decades has smiled sometimes through things that would have silenced a lesser spirit entirely. She is 79 years old now, and the reality of where Dolly Parton stands today, physically, emotionally, privately, is something the world has been slow to reckon with. Not because the signs were hidden, but because the smile was always brighter than the shadows behind it, and the world on the whole preferred the smile. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on the 19th of January 1946 in a one-room cabin in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, a place so remote it existed, yet for most of her childhood, outside the awareness of anyone who hadn't been born into it. She was the fourth of 12 children. 12. A number that, in the mountains of the Great Smoky Range in the 1940s, meant not abundance but survival arithmetic. Every child another mouth. Every winter another calculation. Every spring a question the mountain did not always answer with mercy. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, could not read or write. Her mother, Avie Lee Owens, sang hymns in the kitchen and held the family together with the particular unspectacular heroism of women who have no other option. There was no running water. There was no electricity. There was a shared bed among children, a fireplace that was never quite enough, and a mountain that was beautiful in the way that only places indifferent to human suffering can be. And the beauty was real. So was the cold. She would spend the rest of her life turning that poverty into poetry, into rhinestones and wigs and a laugh so large it became its own kind of architecture. A shelter she built for herself and then opened to everyone who needed it. The transformation was so complete, so radiant, so seemingly effortless that the world forgot to look at what had been transformed, what it had cost, what it had required of the girl who had once slept 4 to a bed in a cabin without glass in the windows. That girl is 79 years old now, and she is tired in ways that the sequins have stopped hiding. In recent years, Dolly Parton has faced a series of physical and personal trials that have accumulated with the quiet cruelty of things that arrive not in dramatic single blows, but in a steady, relentless procession. Her hearing has dimmed in ways she can no longer joke entirely away. Her body, which she has spoken about candidly and sometimes with characteristic humor, has begun to carry the accumulated weight of 8 decades of relentless performance, travel, and output. She was involved in a car accident in Tennessee in 2023 that left its mark on a frame that is no longer 29 or 39 or even 69. She has spoken, in the careful language of a woman who has always known when to hold something back, about the grief of losing people she has loved. A procession of goodbyes that has only lengthened with time and shows no sign of stopping. And beneath all of it, beneath the health updates and the public appearances and the carefully managed image of indestructibility, there is the quieter, more private story of a woman at 79 confronting something every human being must eventually face. The simple, undeniable reality of limitation, of mortality, of the body's slow renegotiation of the terms of the life it has carried for nearly 8 decades. The world built a legend around Dolly Parton. Legends, by their nature, do not age. They do not tire. They do not wake up in the morning with pain in their joints and silence in the rooms where loved ones used to be. But Dolly Parton is not a legend. She is a woman. And the full truth of what that woman is living through right now, at 79 in the quieter chapters of an extraordinary life, is something this story will not flinch from. How did the girl from Locust Ridge survive everything the mountain, the industry, and time itself threw at her? And what does survival look like when the whole world is watching? There is a specific kind of poverty that does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive with the theatrical despair of sudden collapse or the visible ruins of something that was once better. It simply exists, quietly, completely, as the only reality a child has ever known. And it shapes everything that comes after it in ways that prosperity never fully erases. That was the poverty of Locust Ridge. Dolly Parton grew up in a world where the beauty of the Great Smoky Mountains existed in permanent, indifferent contrast to the conditions of the life lived beneath them. The cabin her family occupied had one room. The walls let in the cold. The floor was bare. The family of 14, my 2 parents, 12 children, moved through that space with the practiced efficiency of people who have learned to need less because less is all there is. She wore flour sacks sewn into dresses. She went to school in shoes that did not always fit. She carried hunger not as an occasional visitor, but as a household member who never left the table. The mountains themselves were a particular kind of teacher. Beautiful and remote and entirely indifferent to human aspiration, they offered the specific lesson that only geography can give. That the world is large and your place in it is small, and that smallness is either the end of the story or the beginning of a decision. For Dolly Parton, from the earliest age anyone around her could remember, it was never the end. It was always the beginning. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a tobacco and corn farmer who worked the land with his hands and could not read a single word of the Bible he carried to church every Sunday. Dolly learned early to read it to him, sitting beside him in the evenings after the work was done, translating the written word into spoken sound for a man whose intelligence lived entirely in his hands and his endurance. That image, the small girl with the large voice reading scripture aloud to the father who couldn't, contains everything you need to understand about who she became. The gift given in service of love before it was ever given in service of fame. The voice as an instrument of connection rather than performance. Her mother, A.V. Lee Owens, sang constantly. In the kitchen, over the washing, in the quiet between children's arguments and the noise of a house too small for the life it held. Music in the Parton household was not a luxury or an ambition. It was the air. It was what moved through the rooms when words weren't sufficient, which in a home of that size with losses of that frequency was often. A child born early or a crop that failed or a winter that stretched past its reasonable end. The music absorbed it, transformed it, sent it back into the world in a form the body could bear. Dolly began performing before she had a name for what performing was. She sang in her grandfather Jake Owens's Pentecostal church, the kind of church where music was not entertainment, but transmission, where the voice was understood as a direct channel between the human and the divine, where the congregation expected to feel something and was disappointed if it didn't. Her grandfather, a preacher of considerable conviction and old-fashioned suspicion of worldly ambition, initially regarded secular music with deep unease. He prayed over Dolly's ambitions more than once, asking God to redirect what he feared was a gift pointed in the wrong direction. God, it appears, had already decided. By the time she was 10 years old, she was performing on local radio. The Cass Walker Farm and Home Hour in Knoxville gave her her first microphone, her first audience beyond the church, her first taste of what it felt like to have a room full of strangers lean toward you because of what was coming out of your mouth. She leaned back. The instinct was immediate and complete. as if the space between a performer and an audience was a language her body had already learned to speak before anyone had taught her the words. Still, the path from Locust Ridge to anywhere required crossing a distance that was not merely geographical. On the day after her high school graduation in 1964, she was 17 years old, not yet 18. Dolly Parton packed a single bag, said goodbye to the mountain, and boarded a bus to Nashville. Her family gathered to see her off. Her mother cried. Her father did not, because Robert Lee Parton expressed love in silence and in labor, not in tears. And perhaps because a man who had spent his life enduring things without commentary understood, better than most, that this was simply the next thing that had to happen. Dolly carried both of them with her into a city that had heard 1,000 girls from 1,000 small towns arrive with a single bag and a voice and a certainty the city had met before. What the city had not met before was Dolly Parton. She met Carl Dean on her first full day in Nashville. He was outside a laundromat on the first afternoon of her new life, and she was doing her washing. And he pulled up and looked at her and said something that made her laugh. Carl Dean was quiet where she was loud, private where she was public, deeply and permanently content with ordinary life in a way that her ambition never would be and never needed to be. They were, in every measurable way, opposites, and they were, from that first afternoon, exactly right for each other. They married on the 30th of May, 1966, in a small ceremony in Ringgold, Georgia, with almost no one present. No fanfare, no industry attention. Just the two of them and the decision they were making, in the quiet way that the most important decisions are sometimes made. Not announced, but simply done. For nearly 6 decades that followed, Carl Dean would remain the most consistent and most invisible presence in a life defined by constant visibility. He attended almost none of her performances. He gave almost no interviews. He built a road paving business in Tennessee and ran it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. And he went home to her when she came back to him. And that was the whole arrangement. And it worked in the particular way that arrangements work when both people have genuinely agreed to them. She joined Porter Wagoner's syndicated television program in 1967. Porter Wagoner was a country music institution. Tall, blonde, rhinestone-suited, generous with his platform and protective of his investment in equal and sometimes indistinguishable measure. He introduced Dolly to a national audience of millions who had never heard of her. He also introduced her to the specific experience of having your talent exist, professionally, inside someone else's frame. By 1973, she had outgrown the frame. The truth, however, was that leaving was not simple. Wagoner felt ownership. He threatened legal action. And Dolly Parton, who had grown up in a cabin where conflict had to be navigated without the luxury of withdrawal, did what she had always done when the mountain pressed in from every side. She wrote a song. I Will Always Love You was not a love song. It was a farewell letter. The most gracious possible articulation of a leaving that had already been decided. I love you. I am grateful. I cannot stay. She sang it for Porter before she played it for anyone else. He wept. He released her. And the song born from the necessity of professional departure became one of the most recorded pieces of music in the history of popular music. When Elvis Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, approached her about having Elvis record the song with the condition of 50% of the publishing rights attached, Dolly Parton declined. She was a young woman from a mountain in Tennessee who understood in her body what it meant to have something taken by someone with more power, and who had decided somewhere along the way that her work was worth protecting. She declined. Elvis never recorded it. She has never expressed regret. "I knew what the song was worth," she has said. She always knew what things were worth. That, perhaps more than the voice or the work ethic or the rhinestones, that was the deepest thing the mountain gave her. Her parents were both alive for the early years of her ascent. Robert Lee, who had held a Bible he could not read, lived to see his daughter's name on every major marquee in the country. Avie Lee, who had sung over the washing in a one-room cabin, lived to hold Grammy Awards that belonged to the child her music had shaped. They both died before the hardest years came. Robert Lee in 2000, Avie Lee in 2003, and with them went the last living witnesses to the girl before the legend. The only people on earth who had known Dolly Parton before she had learned to perform Dolly Parton for the world. By the time the 1980s arrived, Dolly Parton had done what almost no one in the history of country music had managed before her. She had crossed over, not merely commercially, though 9 to 5, hitting #1 on both the country and pop charts simultaneously, and her face appearing on magazine covers that had never before considered a woman from Appalachia worthy of their attention, was undeniable. She had crossed over in a deeper, more permanent sense. She had moved from being a genre's greatest treasure to being a culture's landmark. From a voice that the American South claimed as its inheritance to a presence the entire English-speaking world recognized on sight and received with something close to affection. The film career changed the dimensions of her public life in ways the music, enormous as it was, had not fully prepared anyone for. 9 to 5 revealed her to audiences who had never paid attention to country radio. The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas in 1982 demonstrated that the warmth she carried was not merely decorative. It was structural, load-bearing, the thing that held a room together when everything else threatened to go sideways. And Steel Magnolias in 1989 introduced her to a generation too young to know Jolene, a film about women, grief, friendship, and the specific courage of people who choose each other through the worst things. And Dolly inhabited it as if the camera had been built around her. But the empire she was building in those same years was the thing that would outlast all of it. Dollywood opened in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee on the 1st of May, 1986. It was not simply a theme park, it was a monument. To the Smoky Mountains she had come from, to the Appalachian culture the rest of the country had spent generations either ignoring or condescending to, and to the version of the American dream that begins not in a city with capital and connections, but in a hollow with capability and nerve. She bought into a failing park and transformed it into something that bore her name, her values, and the specific defiant pride of a region that had been told for too long it had nothing worth celebrating. Dollywood employed thousands of people from communities bypassed by every other economy that passed through. It became, over the decades, one of the most visited tourist destinations in the American South, generating a sustained economic impact in Sevier County that no government program had managed to produce. She built it from the mountain. She gave it back to the mountain. And then came the Imagination Library. In 1995, she started a program in Sevier County that mailed one free book per month to every registered child from birth until the first day of kindergarten. No income threshold, no application process. Every child, every month, a book with their name on the label and nothing asked in return. She had built it from a wound, from the private grief of watching her father hold a Bible he could not read, from the understanding carried in her body since childhood that illiteracy is not a personal failure but a structural one. She decided with the quiet resolve of someone who has never needed an audience for her most important work to change that access for every child within her reach, By the time she was 79 years old, the Imagination Library had placed over 200 million books in the hands of children across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and beyond. 200 million. All of this was happening while the body was keeping its own accounts. The human body does not forget what is asked of it. The decades of touring, of buses and airports and stages in different time zones, of sleeping in the wrong beds and eating at the wrong hours and performing through illness because the show was already sold and the people had already traveled. Leave deposits that compound quietly until they can no longer be managed quietly. Dolly Parton has spoken in the way of a woman who has decided honesty is cheaper than pretense, about the physical reality of a life that has never really stopped moving. The endometriosis was something she acknowledged publicly, along with the procedures it required and the particular private grief that comes with female health conditions, touching questions larger than health itself. She did not have children. She and Carl made their peace with that fact. It wasn't in God's plan. She has said, in the brief and final way of a woman closing a door she has the right to close. Her hearing began to dim. It is a particular cruelty at the slow withdrawal of sound from a musician. The medium through which you have communicated everything begins to recede from your own access. Dolly has handled this with the humor that is her most reliable first response to anything she cannot control. Joking about hearing aids, about misheard conversations, about the specific comedy of being one of the most recognizable voices on the planet while sometimes struggling to follow a conversation happening 2 feet away. The humor is real. The humor is also, as it has always been, the outermost layer of a much more complex interior. Still, the years accumulate. That is what years do. In November of 2021, Dolly Parton lost her brother Randy. Randy Parton had been a musician, a performer, a member of the Parton family's deep and complicated relationship with music that ran from the church in Locust Ridge through every genre and every decade. He had been ill for some time, and the illness had its own difficult arc. But knowing a loss is coming and receiving the loss when it arrives are not the same experience. And Dolly Parton had known Randy since the one-room cabin, since before Nashville, since before the Rhinestones and the name that meant something beyond Sevier County. He was 72 years old. He was her brother. She said in the quiet days after, "We're a big family. We've had a lot of loss, but it never gets easier. You just get more practiced at carrying it." That sentence, the understated devastation of it, the accuracy of it, the refusal to perform grief in a way that makes the audience more comfortable, is one of the clearest windows into who Dolly Parton actually is when the performance ends. She is a woman who has buried parents and siblings and versions of herself she could not afford to keep. She is a woman who has spent 79 years learning the specific discipline of carrying, of moving forward with the full weight of what has been lost without setting it down and without letting it stop you. If what you've heard so far moves you, if you've ever loved someone you've lost or watched a person you admired hold their life together with more grace than anyone should have to, take a moment right now and leave a like. Because what comes next is the part the headlines rarely reach. In November of 2023 on Interstate 40 near Nashville, Tennessee, Dolly Parton was involved in a car accident. The details as they emerged were not catastrophic in the clinical sense. She was not hospitalized for an extended period. There were no life-threatening injuries in the way the phrase is typically used. But an accident at 77 on a highway in a body that has been in continuous service for 8 decades does not require catastrophe to leave its mark. She sustained injuries to her wrist and hand. She was treated and released. She handled the public disclosure with the characteristic composure of a woman who has been managing difficult information for the benefit of a watching world for most of her adult life. But those close to her described something quieter in the aftermath, a recalibration, the private and specific reckoning that follows a moment when the body's vulnerability makes itself known with sudden, undeniable clarity. Not theoretically, not in the abstract way that aging announces itself gradually, but in the concrete and irreversible way of an impact, a pain, a limitation that was not present the day before. What does it feel like at 79 to look back at 60 years of relentless motion and understand, not theoretically, not philosophically, but in the bones and the wrist and the ear that no longer hears as it once did, that the motion is slowing? She answers it sideways in the spaces between what she says and how she says it. In the interviews where the laugh comes a fraction of a second later than it once did. In the public appearances that have grown fewer and more deliberate, chosen with the care of someone who has learned that presence is finite and deserves to be spent on what matters. In the way she speaks about home now, about Tennessee, about the mountains, about the specific and irreplaceable piece of a place where the world does not need anything from you. The cosmetic procedures have been a subject she has always addressed with a frankness the entertainment industry almost never permits itself. She has had work done. She has said so plainly, repeatedly, without apology, and without excessive elaboration. It takes a lot of money to look this cheap, she has said, and the laugh that follows is entirely genuine. But underneath the joke is a more serious statement about the experience of aging in a culture that mapped its emotional investment in you onto a specific physical version of you, and that experiences genuine disorientation when that version evolves. She has navigated this with more grace and more honesty than almost anyone in her position has managed. Carl Dean is in his early 80s now. He was born in 1942. He has always been a private man, the most famous person almost no one has ever seen, the most constant presence in one of the most public lives of the 20th century. In recent years, those who know the couple describe a shift in the texture of their quiet Tennessee life. Carl has required more presence, more care. Dolly, who has spent the majority of her adult life leaving, for studios, for stages, for the relentless international schedule of a career that never fully stopped, has increasingly chosen to stay, to be there, to give the same consistency to the man at home that she has given to the world on stage for 60 years. She has spoken about this with the careful privacy of a woman protecting someone she loves from the machinery of public interest. Carl is my whole world, she has said. Everything else is wonderful, but he is my whole world. In a life filled with people who have always wanted something from her, her voice, her image, her time, her endorsement, her presence, the man who has wanted nothing but her has remained, after nearly 60 years of marriage, the answer to a question she stopped asking because he made it unnecessary. In 2022, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame announced its intention to induct Dolly Parton. She declined the nomination. She said, with the particular humility of a person who is not performing humility, that she did not feel she had earned an induction into a hall built for rock and roll, that she didn't want to be inducted on the basis of celebrity alone. The music community responded with collective, affectionate refusal to accept her objection. She was nominated again. She was inducted. And she walked onto the induction stage at 76 in a rock and roll corset, performed with the energy of someone who had never once been confused about what she was capable of, and received a standing ovation that was not politeness but recognition. In 2023, she released Rockstar, her first full rock album, a project covering everyone from Led Zeppelin to Leonard Skynyrd, debuting at #1 on the country albums chart. Critics who arrived expecting a vanity project found instead a creative statement from a woman who, at 77, was still more interested in surprising herself than in meeting expectations. But she has owned fewer rooms since. The touring has slowed to almost nothing. The major live commitments have been replaced by selective appearances, chosen with the deliberateness of someone who has learned the true cost of saying yes to everything. The recording continues. The giving continues. The imagination library, the foundation work, the checks written quietly for causes that don't always appear in the press release. At 79, the daily reality is something she has described in fragments across a handful of recent interviews. The regimen of care that a body of 8 decades requires, the physical therapy, the attention to what is eaten and when, the accommodations made for hearing and joint, and the accumulated history of a frame that has been asked to do a great deal for a very long time. The mornings in Tennessee where the mountains are still there, and the quiet is the same quiet it has always been, and the world for a few hours does not need anything from Dolly Parton that she isn't able to give. She has said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not living. And I plan to keep living for as long as God lets me." That sentence is everything. It is the Mountains talking. It is Avie Lee's voice in the kitchen. It is Robert Lee's silence at the door. It is the girl in the flour sack dress who decided, before she had the language for the decision, that whatever the world offered, she would take it with both hands and give it back multiplied. The world has a word for Dolly Parton. Sunshine. It chose that word a long time ago, in the years when a girl from Locust Ridge arrived in Nashville with a single bag, and a voice that the city wasn't ready for, and it has not revised its vocabulary since. Sunshine, as if the warmth were effortless, as if the light cost nothing, as if 79 years of smiling for a world that needed the smile more than it ever stopped to ask what the smile was built on, had left no deposit, no residue, no quiet and private wait in the hours when the cameras were gone and the stage was dark, and the only sound was the Tennessee night and the breathing of the man asleep in the next room. The truth, as this story has tried to hold without flinching, is something more complicated and more worthy of the woman than the single bright word the world settled on. Dolly Parton is a woman who was forged in a poverty so complete it had its own specific texture. The texture of flour sack dresses and shared beds, and a father who held a Bible he could not read and who needed his daughter's voice to carry the words he could not access himself. She is a woman who carried that childhood not as a wound to be healed, but as a foundation to be built on, rhinestone by rhinestone, song by song, until the foundation held something so large that the mountain she came from became one of its permanent features. She is a woman who wrote her most famous goodbye as an act of love, who held her publishing rights in a room that expected her to surrender them, who opened a park in a hollow where prosperity had never arrived, and who mailed books to children she would never meet because she understood, in her bones, what it meant to grow up in a world where the written word was someone else's inheritance. She is a woman who has buried her parents and her brother and earlier versions of herself, who has watched her hearing dim and her body recalibrate, and her schedule slow to the rhythm that 79 years eventually insist upon, who has sat beside a man who built roads while she built legends, and who has chosen, more and more, to let the legends carry themselves while she tends to the smaller and more sacred things. The bedtime, the morning, the quiet cup of coffee in the Tennessee, light before the world wakes up and starts needing something again. She is tired in ways the sequence have stopped hiding. That is true. She is also still here. Still recording, still giving, still choosing with the particular stubbornness of a woman who grew up where stubbornness was not a character flaw, but the only available response to a world that kept saying no. Still choosing, every morning, to keep going. In the silence between the health updates and the public appearances and the carefully managed image of indestructibility, what endures is not the image. Images fade. What endures is the architecture of a life built in deliberate service to something larger than itself. The 200 million books. The park that gave an economy to a hollow. The donation that helped develop a vaccine that saved lives she will never count and is never mentioned again. The quiet man in the next room for whom she has increasingly chosen to be present. Because presence, she has learned, is the most valuable thing a person can offer, and the one thing that cannot be sent ahead or caught up on later. The world built a legend around Dolly Parton, but legends do not leave behind 200 million books. Legends do not choose to stay home. Legends do not cry about brothers and laugh about hearing AIDS in the same breath, and tell the truth about cosmetic surgery and decline Hall of Fame nominations out of genuine humility and then show up anyway in a rock and roll corset and own the room entirely. Those are the actions of a woman. And the woman, at 79, is still the most extraordinary thing about the legend. She spent 79 years being everyone's reason to smile, and now, in these quieter chapters, in the Tennessee mornings and the slower schedule and the deliberate presence beside the man who has always been her whole world, she is finally, slowly, on her own terms, allowing herself to simply be. Not to perform, not to deliver, not to give the world the version of herself it has always expected, but to be the girl from Locust Ridge who never had glass in the windows, sitting in a house where the warmth is reliable and the mountains are still outside, and everything she built is still standing. So is she. And now, dear viewer, this story belongs to you. Not as something to consume and scroll past, but as an invitation to sit for a moment with the full weight of a life that was always more than the smile it showed the world. What is it about Dolly Parton's story that stays with you? What part of what she has carried reminds you of something you carry yourself? Tell us in the comments. Because the stories that matter most are not the ones we watch. They are the ones that find us where we actually are and stay. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe so the next untold chapter finds you when it arrives. The sunshine was always real. It just never came free.